Hello, and welcome to The Alt Left.
Welcome back, everyone, to episode 37 of The Alt Left. I am your host, Comrade Chris. With me is the Reverend Dr. K.
Good evening, everyone.
And Mailbag Matt.
Mailbag. I like that. Can we do mail sack, Matt?
I was supposed to say mailman, and I said mailbag. You know what? I'm keeping it. Let's. Today we're objectifying Matt.
And my sack.
It is pretty glorious.
Pendulous and sweet.
Yeah, it is.
So we are going to be talking about communism today, as promised.
Yay!
The specter of communism that has haunted Europe, as Churchill said. And we're going to talk a little bit about where it is, where it came from, what it is. It's going to be real brief. So basically, our history of socialism is that, and I got this directly from American textbooks. Basically, one day Satan presented Karl Marx to the Russians. He immediately swallowed the Romanov family whole and defecated two twins, Stalin and Lenin. Lenin sacrificed himself as the Antichrist to make the Soviet Union succeed, and Stalin served as a false prophet, eating bald eagles, puppies, and American children for daily sustenance. Shortly after, America defeated Stalin by planting a flag on the moon, and thus all space was legally and morally set aside for capitalism and the American way. Once this happened, Stalin immediately disintegrated, and his ashes were given like rings of power to Vietnam, Cuba, Venezuela, and China, where they still poison the land to this day. And that's the end of our story. Day is safe. Go America. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. We appreciate it.
Absolutely.
It was a lot of fun.
Great
I learned
episode.
so much this episode. Yeah.
Wonderful.
We strive to educate on this podcast more than anything else, so I hope that was good, as good for everyone else as it was for us.
And I really hope we help. Yeah, God bless America. Go America. See you next week, everybody. Back to actual reality. We are going to be talking about socialism and communism today, and kind of what it means. One of the biggest things that has spurred this idea that Matt's been itching to do this topic, and one of the big ones,
long,
is because a lot of people don't really know the difference of socialism, communism. What are these things? What are the different words? And they're a lot more interchangeable than people think. First of all, word definition. Okay, according to Oxford, which is not the best source for left-leaning politicking or political theory, but it is a good one for word definitions. Oxford defines socialism, and we're going to talk later about how the UK might not be the best source for socialist information, but socialism is a political and economic theory of social organization which advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned and regulated by the community as a whole. So basically, it's an economic theory that these means of production, which are factories, which are anything that produces money, goods, or services, anything that produces capital, which is wealth, should be owned and managed by the people. Communism is a political theory derived directly from Karl Marx, advocating class war and leading to a society in which all property is publicly owned and each person works and is paid according to their abilities and needs. Now, I definitely take issue with the negative tone on that one, but I mean, again, what do you expect from capitalists? Bias exists. We all have it. You can kind of already see the smear campaign going there, where it's like, socialism is a political theory, and they believe that things should be owned. And it's like, communism wants to take your children away from you and start a class war, and all property is publicly owned. That's not even close to true. That is not the reality. Ask any actual theory-read communist, right, what this means. And there's a difference of properties. I think that's one of the biggest issues. The first thing we need to tackle is what is property? Marx talked a lot about this, and we'll go into this. But basically, to communists, there are three types of property. There is public property, private property, and personal property. Public property is things like government buildings. It's parks. Schools, that kind of thing, things that are open to the public. And even in the United States, we have exceptions to that where there's private property like a business center, but if it has driveways into the street, there's multiple businesses and has communal parking, it's considered private property with public access, right? You can't nail someone for walking across it, that kind of thing. But typically public property is government owned and regulated buildings and or land meant to be used for public use. Private property is things like a business, a farm. Even that's a bad example, but private property would be like a factory. Private property is a big company. Coca-Cola is private property. All of its factories, its trademarks, its formulas, all of its products, that is private property. Okay, if you go out and buy a JanSport backpack, the factory that was made in, the materials that exist within it, the labor that was produced, and the backpack that was sold are private property. And then you have personal property, and personal property is the backpack once purchased. Once you have that backpack, that is your backpack. Okay, so again, let's say K needs to get a backpack. K is going to hop in his car, which is personal property, belongs solely to him. He is going to drive it on public property, which is a road, to get to a store, which is a business that is private property. In that private property, he will buy a backpack, making that backpack his personal property, which he will take back to through the private property parking lot to his personal property car to drive on public property roads to go back home, in which case he will take his private property backpack into his private property home. And I know that's a long road to get there, no pun intended, but that's the definition, and they're important. Is everyone still with me?
Yeah, I'm totally with you.
And I should just also mention, like, when we're talking about property, we are going to be using these definitions for this episode. That's the reason why Chris went into such lengths to define them adequately, is so because that is when we're talking about property, these are the accepted definitions we are going to be using.
Yes,
and it's necessary for the conversation.
Yeah, well, especially if we're going to be talking about the differences in terminologies and misgivings on this, but capitalists use this property term, and it's a typical tactic of the right, is to basically play word games. Well, I don't want to wear a mask, so I'm going to own the libs and say my body, my choice. They're always going for semantical arguments, and that's what this is. Because just like Oxford, puts in their definition of communism, all property is publicly owned. And it's like, well, that's bullshit. Marxism at its most fanatical roots never, ever insinuates or suggests that personal property should ever be publicly owned. It says private property should, because private property is the means of production, and it wants workers to own and control these things. But your home, your car, your backpack, the groceries in your fridge, your refrigerator itself, these are private property that literally no one, right, left, Marxist, capitalist, thinks should be publicly owned. It's a non sequitur BS argument that doesn't need to exist. Arguing about whether or not communists want to publicly own everything you have is, you might as well worry about unicorns taking it as well.
Yeah, and you hit on something too that I want to clarify. We're going to be getting into this more, but what Chris was talking about, Marxism, Marx, as most people should know, is the one who basically created communism. That it was his.
No, Marx is the author of the Communist Manifesto.
Okay, fair enough. But the modern inclination of what communism should be, like, it starts with him. Like, I mean, he's the one that I would say, like, branded it.
Kind of. Okay, so let's do a little history here. So,
well, hold on. The only thing I want to say is just to be clear, there are distinctions to be made. So, what typically, and again, we're going to get into this, what most people perceive as communism is not what Marx was talking about.
Correct.
Sorry, Chris. There's the one little thing I wanted to mention.
No, and I think it's a really good one, which is why when people are the only people who typically say things like communist China and communist this are people who don't understand the nuanced differences, which is why actual communists talk about Maoists and Leninists and Stalinists and Trotskyists and Marxists, because these are different theories. They're completely different. Trotsky and Stalin could not have had more different views on the role of the state for people, but they were in full agreement that you should be killing people who don't work hard enough, which is actually my big complaint against Trotsky. Yep. Whereas
gulags
Lenin
were still in place under Trotsky, without a doubt.
Well, gulags were in place under Lenin. They just weren't called gulags,
and they weren't as widespread as they were when Stalin came about.
They were not as nasty. They were not as widespread. Gulags under Lenin existed literally for counter-revolutionaries and terrible people, and under Stalin they turned into, well, anybody who pisses off the Mario mustache goes to the gulag. It's kind of anyone who Stalin didn't like went to a gulag. So that was kind of where the difference is.
Because I've been trying I knew I was going to have to keep up with you. So I was trying really hard to get all this stuff down so I could at least keep up with you on this one.
This is great. This is the kind of intellectual discourse we need in the world. People need to read this stuff, hate it, love it. It doesn't matter. You can, I know Kay and I disagree on a lot of this stuff. But at no point do I think that Kay is uninformed or unread or that his opinion isn't nuanced. Like, we can disagree. We all need to have these conversations, though. And as soon as you get into hyperbole and start calling people sycophants and blah, 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 that's where you come into the problem. If we're all on the left, we need to be able to have disagreements. And even I'll talk about people like Democratic Socialists, who I think the Democratic Socialist Party is awful. But not because not because I hate all their stances. I think they're right on a lot of things. I don't like the way the political party is run, but that's a nuanced opinion that we can't get into if we're going to throw bottles at each other.
Yep.
Save your bottle throwing for the fucking Nazis. When it comes to Marx and Marxism, so socialism, again, and that's kind of is that socialism and communism are different, but also synonymous. And that's what makes it really unique. Okay. So the true difference between socialism and communism, right? Is socialism is a little more economic. Communism is a little more political, but they both are deeply rooted in both. Socialism means that everyone should own the common means of production. People should be receiving pay to sustain their needs regardless of what their job is. Doctors should not be incredibly wealthy while fast food workers are poor. They should both be getting wages that support them and their families. It says that education should be free. It says that the purpose of the government should be to serve the people and their needs. And it also says that the people should be owning things. Amazon should be a publicly owned and regulated company. There should be no private shareholders. Under socialism, the stock market would cease to exist. Okay, this is what socialism is. Communism, which, by the way, hasn't existed in the modern era. Communism, there is no religion, there is no money, there is no property that is not personal property. Okay, in communism, we literally see the abolition of capital in its entirety. Resources are moved around and money stops existing. Okay, communism is not something that China decided to instill in their good. Communism is a word that communists, things people believe in, use to describe the theory and their goals. Okay, a Christian is not someone who thinks they are Christ. A Christian is someone who says Christ's message was awesome and I'm into it. Well, at least non-American Christians.
I did forget one thing with your definition there, Chris. You forgot that we also want to murder and eat babies of everybody that isn't religious. We also want to take everyone and just throw them into gulags. And I think we also worship Satan, right?
Well, and hold on real quick. Everyone should be part of the Satanic Temple because they're amazing. But the whole eating babies thing, the only reason it's true is that a lot of early communists didn't believe in imbibing in alcohol. And the sacramental wine that babies drink at church really spoils the meat. So it's actually more of a health code violation than ethics. So that's
But of course, all that's horseshit. Just like anybody that's trying to turn people that support the ideas associated with communism into some kind of raging monsters that just want to worship Stalin's image throughout the United States, because it's all horseshit propaganda that doesn't hold water when you talk to anybody who's got, there are some Stalinists out there, but they're largely dumbasses.
Tankies exist, man. They're everywhere.
But I'm just saying,
they're not liked by the community either.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is every community has idiots in it. The left isn't free from them. Look at the Jimmy Dore cultists. Those guys are leftists, but they're fucking morons. Do I agree with them on stuff? Sure. Do I agree with a lot of their ideas when it comes to Dore and fucking stupid shit like that? No, not at all. Every single group you have is going to have the worst stupid members of it that are going to scream the loudest. You cannot judge those groups by the stupidest among them.
No, and you have to judge what a majority of them are doing and what is the philosophy they're actually preaching. Because I can look at a group who does things that are illegal, or we might consider dick moves, but they're kind of doing it for a benefit that is semi-good or, morally upright. And then I can look at, let's say, a group of Proud Boys who aren't doing anything wrong, who are just standing and holding Trump flags. And I can still say that one is a piece of shit, because what's your philosophy? What are you standing for? Well, if you're standing for white nationalism, then I don't care how peaceful or calm or good or how many chickens you're feeding. Like, I don't give a shit. You're advocating for white.
Blah, 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 blah. Their leader is from Cuba. He can't be racist.
Actually, so funny thing, not only is he no longer the leader, turns out he was an FBI informant the entire time. That came out not that long ago, which I love, because fuck the FBI, but fuck the Proud Boys. So before we go off too much of a tangent, let's get the history lesson out of the way. So everyone, take a swig of your coffee before you pass out on me. So socialism and communism, again, we're going to use them kind of interchangeable, because communism is an end goal. Socialism is the political and economic theory and engine to get us there. Communism is the ketchup. Socialism is the French fry. Okay, that's where we're going. So anyone who's like, they're a communist nation, it's like, well, they're actually not. They've called themselves that. They've labeled them. But so what? We label ourselves a democracy. We're not a democracy. On paper, we're a republic. In reality, we're an oligarchy. So calling yourself something doesn't mean shit. Yeah, fucking Nazis called themselves socialists.
Well, and is anybody truly what they call themselves? Any country?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. The UK and France call themselves democratic republics, and that's pretty accurate. And
okay,
I would say most countries are what they call themselves.
Yeah, but I think Kay's getting more towards the point of, like, a lot of countries will position themselves as things other than they are. But when it comes to this specific thing, yes, Chris is right. Like, they do kind of absolutely say what they are. When it comes to the U.S., we absolutely do not.
Yeah, Mexico's pretty upfront about them being a republic. So anyway, so socialism has a lot of roots long before Karl Marx, right? So the first time we're really kind of seeing it in what would be anything like socialism is in ancient Greece, something called koinonia. I'm going to mispronounce that. It's spelled K-O-I-N. Anyway, it's koinonia. And basically in English, it kind of means fellowship, brotherhood, that kind of thing. And it was a philosophy. Right. Most people, it basically meant that the wealthy would give a majority of their wealth to the poor. And they would do things like serve public office without pay or any kind of compensation. So yeah, they would forgive any debtors who were struggling with paying them back. And even if we're going to talk ancient Greece, Plato is very famously wrote the book Republic, which is what most people kind of consider Plato's big work. And he made a huge argument that basically that humankind wouldn't be free until we had a common distribution of property. That's socialism. That's what that is. And the modern iterations of this go all the way back to the 1700s. If we're going to talk about them, if we're going to get out of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, whatever, if we want to talk about like Western culture in the modern age, right? It coincides with the Industrial Revolution. There's a reason for this. Marx said that himself. This is about class struggle. And in the Industrial Revolution, you suddenly have coal, coal and steam powered plants. All of a sudden, you have furnaces that can be lit anywhere. It doesn't just have to be a small factory by a river. You've got manufacturing happening in mass. Steelworks start going up everywhere. We start having advances like massive interchangeable parts. We start having industries start to learn. Was it the what's the term for it? Kay, you'd know this. It helps in steel productions. The Bessemer something.
Bessemer process.
Bessemer process. Thank you. Yeah, that comes around at this time where people like Carnegie, right, one of the biggest producers of steel the world has ever seen and one of the richest men of his time, it's because he has these Bessemer converters for this that he realizes, I don't need to ever stop them. Turning them off means I'm not making money. Let them be destroyed. Who cares? And so he started running them all the time, letting them get destroyed because he didn't care. He would make more money by increasing the mass of production.
It was actually cheaper and easier to just leave them on, than it was to turn them off and turn them back on. And that's actually something that goes through to this day in a lot of industries. It's cheaper to just leave stuff on than it is to turn it off and turn it back on.
There's a lot of shit that you end up doing at a loss because it makes sense in the long run. Like I remember Xbox One, Xbox and the Xbox 360 came out. Microsoft sold those at a loss.
They still do to this day, as well as Sony. And they do that based on the fact that they're looking at selling games and that's how they're making their money, they still lose money on every unit they sell.
Because that's not where the cash crop is.
Yeah, but it's the same reason your cell phone company is willing to knock hundreds of dollars off of your phone price to get you to sign on, because they know they're going to get you locked in for years. Like, they're going to make money on your monthly payments. You're going to pay 80% of the phone's value, the cost, which, by the way, they're knocking it off retail. They're not even going at a loss. They're basically killing their profit margin on hardware sales is all they're doing. And then they're breaking it in on monthly premiums.
They make their money on the actual service. They don't make their money on product.
Exactly.
They don't make hardly any money on that case that they gave you at $20 instead of the $40 that it's labeled at.
Yeah.
They don't make any money on that. They make the money on that monthly charge that you're paying for.
That's exactly what it is. And also in terms of production, that's the service sector. In terms of production, if you make something at such a high volume, you can bring down the profit per piece, right? So if you're making 100 units of something a day, right, you have a daily cost of operations. You take that out of the materials and the labor and all that. And at the end of the day, you have a profit margin. How much money in profit am I making? Which means I need to make this much money to stay in business. But what if you make 7,000 of that product in a day? Well, you can make your profit margin a lot smaller. If you're selling 7,000 of something versus 100 of something, you can start charging less and less for it. And what that does, it still keeps you making the same amount of profit, but it fucks over every single competitor you could possibly have. This is what Carnegie did. This is how Union Steel and Oil were born. This is how robber barons took over the nation, was by realizing they could just maximize production. Even if sometimes we're going at a loss, there's some times of the year where it costs more to make it. Doesn't matter. Crank it the fuck out, because even if we have to lose some money, it is profitable to fuck everyone else out of competition with us. Because once we become the only game in town, we can do things like hold our product hostage on the railroads and actually force railroads to give us a discount. Again, now when it's my oil getting transported on a train car, it's transporting for cheaper, lowers the price I can sell it at. Now, a lot of capitalists will say, well, that's great. That's savings that trickles down to the consumer. But that's not why they do it. They do it to fuck over competition, because once the competition is gone, you can jack up your rates to be whatever you want. You corner the markets. What Uber has just recently done. Yeah. Uber has operated at a loss since its inception until very recently. And they did that on purpose. They drove out everyone who tried to be in competition with them. The only ones who were able to pull it off was Lyft, and they haven't done as well, and they were doing the same game. And now they've all jacked their prices up because now they have to make a profit. But what they did was make sure there wasn't a bunch of competing companies. They made sure they cornered the market. So now they can jack the price up to whatever they want. So one of the things people will talk about with the free market is that the free market breeds innovation. The free market breeds competition, and that will bring down prices and raise quality. And it doesn't. The free market breeds monopolies. That's the point of it, is you are to eat your competitors, and then once you're the only game in town, you become huge. And so you had two camps when the Industrial Revolution bred that thought. And so you have guys like Voltaire and Kant, who basically get credited as these great minds who created laissez-faire capitalism. And again, at the time, that was a liberal belief because monarchies controlled things. So the idea that a regular person could do stuff is amazing, and that's why you have that term like classic liberalism that people talk about, where they're ultra capitalist. That's what that is, because it was a liberal idea at the time. But like, wait a second, you don't own a castle. You're not allowed to do commerce. The idea that like, no, I'm just rich and I don't have any noble blood and I'm still allowed to be rich. That was novel and progressive as fuck.
Yeah, but then the same thing that happened with monarchies is what's happening now. The rich have gotten super rich, super powerful. They control everything, and they don't want to let that power go. So they've continually gamed the system so that anybody that would normally be able to get that power can't.
Oh yeah, we'll get there. Yeah, absolutely. That is always the end goal of a capitalistic system. And it's not like people are just now waking up to this. It's kind of the argument against American slavery. When I'll hear people talk about like slave owning founding fathers and that kind of thing, they'll be like, well, it was the 1700s. People didn't know any better back then. Yeah, everyone knew better back then. In the 1700s, people were railing against American slavery. The British stopped trading with certain places because of it. The British had outlawed it. The Dutch had outlawed it. I mean, it was illegal in a lot of places. It was, by the time the Americans were in our own game and had independence, it was happening here and like Cuba and like Haiti and a couple other places. And that was basically it. The slave trade was toast because everyone was like, whoa, that's chattel slavery is super fucked up.
Yeah,
and it was well known.
You glossed over it, but the motherfuckers who started the slave trade, the Dutch, stopped doing it before the United States.
Yes.
Let that
people
sink
who profited most.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the thing is, so this idea that people didn't, it's always bullshit. I'm sorry. Ethics and morality exist regardless of time. Certain circumstances can push popular beliefs forward. But the idea that torturing and killing and causing destruction and terribleness towards other humans, no, we've known that since the cave. So we talked about Voltaire and Kant, but Thomas Paine, who's pretty much known as like one of the greatest philosophers, not only in English history, but in pretty much Western civilization that isn't Greek. You know, everyone likes Thomas Paine. He wrote the famous Agrarian Justice, and I don't remember what year it was. It was late 1700s. It was very late 1700s. It was almost the 1800s. I want to say it was like 1790s, 1780s. And in that time, that's where he argued that landowners needed to be taxed more, and not just taxed more, they need to be taxed in the relation to the needs of the poor. The tax burden on wealthy landowners needs to reflect what the poor need, and then it needs to be distributed to them. That's socialism, and that's in the 1700s in England. And before that, now, Thomas Paine, everyone knows about Agrarian Justice. Almost the thing that made Thomas Paine famous is a book he wrote called Rights of Man. And in there, he advocated for a comprehensive program of state support for the population to basically ensure the welfare of all of society, regardless of who you were. And part of that was including a state subsidy for poor people. He wanted state-financed universal public education, which is something we finally have now, but he wanted it then. And he wanted state-sponsored prenatal care and postnatal care, which we still don't have, including state subsidies to families when they had children. Okay, so he recognized that, in his words he's recognizing that a person's labor ought to be over before old age, is what he said. And he also, and for that, he called for all workers to have a pension that starts at 50 and would then double when they turn 60 years old. So in 1770s, Thomas Paine was ahead of the Western world in 2021. These are not new thoughts. So then where do like words like socialism, communism come from in the modern era? It's the French Revolution is where this really gets big, because the American Revolution was a revolution for capitalists. It was land owning, very wealthy men who didn't want to have the British stopping them from stealing land from natives and committing genocide. This was not about freedom. This was not about the betterment of mankind or liberty. So this was about rich people wanting to get richer and it was very libertarian. They didn't want government regulation anymore. And so, but the French Revolution was not. The French Revolution was about cutting off the heads of kings who were starving the shit out of the people. A very different motivation. It was actually a revolution from the commoners, not from the wealthy. And that was the difference of the two. So anyway, after the French Revolution, France is teeming with like awesome social philosophers, right? They're all over the place. It's a no pun intended. It's a renaissance of philosophy. France is all about this shit. Bunch of dudes with bad accents, drinking wine and talking shit about rich people. It was fucking great. My kind of place. And they were really talking about communal ownership of private property. And that was gaining a lot of public acceptance. People, the common people, wanted public buildings to be in public control, and things like warehouses and shops to be in public control. And one of the famous guys, again, another name I'm going to butcher. I wrote it down here. It's Henry de Saint-Simon, but I'm sure it's Saint-Simon or whatever. I don't know. Henry de Saint-Simon, though, as a dumb American would pronounce it.
Actually, I think you did it better on that back end. Saint-Simon sounds pretty on
Saint-Simon. Well, he's the founder of French socialism. That's what he's famous for. Is the French version. He's the French Karl Marx. And where Marx got a lot of his ideas from, actually. He was an early sociologist back before sociology was even a thing. And he was actually one of the ones who pioneered for sociological study to have the same research and attention that the physical sciences did. So he was basically saying, hey, chemistry's great, but we should also be dealing with some social sciences and finding out why, poor people are dying. And his basic theory, and it's going to rhyme a lot with Marxism here, is he categorized society into two general classes, right? The workers, which is, and this is where we get terms like bourgeoisie. You have the workers, who later Marx would be called the proletariat, who are the workers who they comprise wage laborers, manufacturers, scientists, engineers, scholars, bankers, merchants, anyone who contributed to production and distribution, right? And then you had the idlers. That's what the bourgeoisie is, the idle rich, and the middle class. We'll talk about that in a minute. But they were people like landowners, okay? Rentiers, people who would rent homes and land to people. The military, the nobility, the clergy. Because remember, at the time, nowadays, there are some clergy who are rich, but they tend to run the cult megachurches, that kind of thing. You don't see a lot of, Methodist bishops with 17 yachts. You don't see that anymore. Modern clergy are working class. But at the time, clergy was very bourgeois back then. If you were a clergy, you knew how to read, you knew how to write, you were part of a giant bureaucracy, and you owned land, and you were able to charge money for things like weddings and funerals and services. Like, you managed the bank accounts of the church, and no one told you what to do with that money. You paid the bills, and everything else was, well, it's for me and God. And I'm just going to take this big pile of money and I'm going to throw it up into the air. Whatever God wants, he keeps. And the rest of it is clearly meant for me. That's the philosophy back then. These guys were loaded. But anyway, these people made no material contributions to the economy. And that was the difference. Is some people are making things and creating an economy. Money is moving around and you're making, you're buying, you're selling, you're feeding people, you're making clothing, you're performing a service, you're cooking food, whatever. And these idlers don't do anything. People who rent land and rent homes don't actually contribute to society. They just take money. They don't build anything. Clergy, what did the clergy do? They ran sacramental rites. They didn't actually contribute. The nobles, they sat in castles and got fed. So that's who he was talking about. And then he dies, and he was a utopianist, which is kind of where he differs from Marxism. But after his death, his followers spread his ideas all over France, and they're the ones who actually coined the term socialism and made it mainstream. And that's where that comes from. So that's where we get socialism and the bourgeoisie. And then shortly after, this is where we get to Daddy Marx, right? This is where some really good beards come into play. Karl Marx and his partner, Friedrich Engels, who's the other person in the Manifesto, and he does not get enough credit, by the way, they were contemporaries. And while Marx had a majority of the ideas here, he was kind of the brains in the organization. Engels was sharp, and it's like Marx was the idea man, and Engels was the function man. Okay, Engels helped Marx make his theories cogent, and he contributed a lot to them. And he's the one who made Marx not sound like the kind of wild-haired, bearded madman that he looked like.
Well, and wasn't he the one that actually wrote most of the actual book?
Yes and no.
Engels?
So basically, Marx was like, I've got this and 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 this, and Engels was like, okay, I'm gonna make this not sound insane, and I'm gonna organize it.
He was the inker. Like in comic book terms, that's what he did. He was the inker.
He was the inker, and in publishing terms, he was the editor and publisher. He was the one who took all of Marx's crazy candlelit napkin scribblings and formed them into a manifesto you can read. And that's a great team. In philosophy, if you have someone who's got crazy wild ideas and someone who knows how to make them sound cogent, that's a good combination.
Otherwise known as the K of our group.
I'm just the editor.
You guys should hear what this sounds like before he gets to it. My God. But we couldn't do this without him. That's the thing. And so it's like having someone who can actually take your insanity and make it palatable. That's a hell of a contribution to the world. Yep. And everyone who has ever published anything had someone like that who never got credited. And it's kind of one of the reasons why I at least like that Engels' name is always on the Communist Manifesto, because he was very much a partner in that.
Yep.
Now, Marx and Engels, they were German, but they were big fans of French socialism. They thought this was a really good thing. They didn't agree with everything. They definitely had some notes, but they thought it was on the right fucking track. And they thought these guys who were looking at this and going, ooh, this is not going well. We're on the money, right? So they basically didn't see the French Revolution as saving the day. They thought it was a good kickoff to some theories, but they already saw the French countryside immediately be turned into what would later be called bourgeoisie democracy, where there was no more royals. And again, the French Revolution scared the shit out of everyone because they killed the fucking king. And that's hardcore. And the British had already been going with some serious problems with their monarchy. And so now the French monarchy's completely collapsed. The German monarchy went through a bunch of problems. Like, this is not going well. And so monarchies got really scared by this. And so that's where that this is a good idea comes into play. But again, they also had some serious gripes. And Marx even is quoted as saying the French Revolution of 1789 abolished feudal property in favor of bourgeois property. So he's basically saying, yeah, the royals don't own everything, but now the ultra wealthy own everything. What's the fucking difference to the worker? And that's kind of one of the things that spurred the writing of this manifesto was they thought the French Revolution kicked socialism off to a great start and they wanted to make some corrections. And so they wrote this thing. And with writing the Communist Manifesto, they codified the theory for the first time ever. You know, socialism is something that's getting talked about in French coffee houses. It's getting screamed at protests. It's getting talked about in their parliament, but it's not written down. There's no code. There's no ethics. This is what we believe. This is what we don't believe. This is the first time it gets fucking written down, right? This is the Council of Nicaea for communism. Was these two guys sitting around candlelight discussing it. And that's where Engels came in, is making it good. A big argument against this, like the nationalists that we almost had on the show, people who are undercover white nationalists like to claim that Marxism is an outside threat to Western culture. And that's kind of puzzling because it was written by a pair of Germans and then it was published in London in 1848. So I don't know what Western culture is, unless you're talking about like Guam. Typically when fucking morons talk about Western culture, they mean white people. Yeah. Who's whiter than Germans and the Brit? I guess the Swedes. I don't know where you're going with this. Yeah, like I'm sure there's some dudes in Finland or in Iceland who are pretty fucking white.
Well, and this is like surface level historical knowledge here. Like, even if you don't know shit about what communism is, which is most of America, most of them know that Marx was fucking German and associate him with communism. No, you don't need to have.
I disagree with that highly. Yeah. I think most people have no idea who Marx was.
Most people think Marx was Russian.
Yeah, and that's part of the problem is they don't realize that this person, Marx, lived early 1800s and died in 1883.
Abraham Lincoln and Karl Marx were alive at the same time.
Yeah. That's part of the problem is everybody thinks of him as
Lincoln actually quoted Marx sometimes.
This guy who started communism in socialist Russia, and it's just not true.
Yeah, not even a little.
We here in the United States had socialism, the idea of socialism, in the late 1800s, all the way up through the early 1900s.
Oh, absolutely. Lincoln wasn't the only president. Like, we've had many presidents that have been, in one way or another, advocating socialist ideas. I'm not going to accuse any of them of being outright like communists or socialists. But again, these ideas that spawned from this are good fucking ideas. That's why so many people have come around to thinking about them. That's why so many presidents have parroted these ideas in a lot of their policies and stuff. I mean, where do you think things like the New Deal come from? That's not coming from capitalism.
Well, that came from Roosevelt's wife.
True. Yeah.
We've had people in our government that were self-espoused socialists since 1910. That's when the first socialist, Victor L. Berger, became the first congressman elected to the House of Representatives. That's when our first socialist, outright called himself a socialist person, was elected to office. And only after the Cold or the start of the Cold War did we really start having this war on communism and socialism.
Correct. In fact, communism and fascism were both accepted in American politics until World War II. Well, okay, fascism was acceptable until World War II. Communism fell out of favor after World War I.
Yeah, but socialism, there was like a dozen different socialist parties here in the United States that started in the late 1800s and really kind of died in the late 1920s, 1930s as we lead up to the Second World War.
Sure. But we're talking about a couple of decades and a lot of political nuance in between then. But
of course we are.
Even while these guys are elected, socialism was already taking a beating in American politics.
Of course it was. That's not what I was saying. I wasn't trying to say that it was like alive and well. I was just trying to say that it was here. We had these ideas. If we hadn't have had World War II, I think that a lot of those ideas would have continued to flourish. World War II was a turning point for a lot of things here in the United States.
No, you're not wrong, but again,
especially with American exceptionalism.
Stalin was in power before World War II, and what he was doing was kind of well known, and people. That's like, I think that's where people started associating like all the shitty things that Stalin did is started getting associated with communism before World War II happened. That's I think what Chris is.
But that's why I said it kind of went out of favor in the 1920s, 1930s. That's well before World War II. But World War II was really the nail in the coffin that stopped this idea of communism or socialism here in the United States.
I would completely disagree.
Why?
Because they were an enemy nation before World War II. We went to war with the Soviet Union right before World War II. They were an enemy.
Yeah, they had a non-aggression pact with Germany. Yeah. Like the only reason they joined us is because Germany attacked them.
Yes, but I've been saying that socialism really kind of fell out of favor right as all of that was starting to happen. And then World War II was the last nail in that coffin. It was the last.
Again, chronologically, but causation does not, or correlation does not equal causation. I don't think World War II had anything to do with it. The only thing that I could possibly say maybe is Churchill got into power and he liked to scream about it like the My Pillow guy, but I don't see how World War II changed anything in terms of, maybe accelerated, but you see the nail in the coffin, and these ideologies were incompatible from the start, and we were already at war over them. The only thing that I think World War II did was cause the Cold War to happen because we were the only two powers left. But in terms of making America anti-socialist or vastly increasing, I don't think in my opinion, I don't think World War II had any, and I'd be open to hearing why, but I don't see any historical reason for that. Because everything we hated about the Soviet Union was in full play before World War II.
Okay, I just see World War II as being like that last step, that last thing that in the eyes of most Americans really turned the general public against communism. World War II ends, we have the Cold War, and it's like we have to beat these commies.
Yes.
And that, to me, changes how an entire generation and an entire country sees an ideology.
And I would agree to that if we weren't also saying that directly before World War II. Like, again, we literally said we have to beat these commies and went over to Russia and started killing them and fought a war. We invaded the Soviet Union. And then World War II breaks out, and we're like, and that's one of the things that Roosevelt got a lot of credit for, was literally making peace with our enemy and made peace with Stalin so that we could fight Nazi Germany. And then the war ended.
And Germany, Nazis, bad, The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Exactly, but that's all it was. It was a pause. It was like the Olympics, It was a pause in hostilities, and then it was business as usual. But now there was nukes.
Yeah, and again, Stalin had a motivation to do that. The guy he had signed a peace treaty with realized, the Western Front isn't going so well. Things look a little easier over here. Let's go this way. And because Hitler fucked over Stalin, that's the only reason Stalin got into World War II.
Here's the thing. Russia and Germany were always going to fight. They hated each other.
Yeah.
The people of the nations didn't like each other. In fact, literally the Soviet Revolution was based on annex Germany. Like, the plan of the early Soviets, like Trotsky and Lenin, was like, okay, as soon as we're done here, we're marching into Germany and we're going to turn them. And then the war broke out. And Hitler knew that, which is why he was so vehemently anti-communist. Not just because socialists and communists tend to see Jews as fellow proletarians, but also because communism was the thing that was planning on marching over and toppling his stupid little shit empire. And the Russians, communists don't like fucking fascists because they're antithetical. And so they were always going to go to war. But yeah, Stalin was basically going, well, I'm going to hold off as long as I can. Yeah. And so, once Hitler invaded, it was like, I'll fucking work with anyone. I don't give a shit. a lot of people kind of assume that Stalin was caught off guard. It's like, oh, he knew this was coming. He always knew he was coming. He was buying as much time as possible to start turning farms into tank warehouses.
Yeah.
Which is why a lot of people died in Russia who weren't shot by Nazis. Never going to defend Stalin on things like the Holodomor and the famines that he caused and the problems he created, especially in places like, fucking Poland, but like, and
Ukraine,
yeah. The Holodomor is one of the greatest crimes in humanity. However, Stalin had to choose who to feed. At the end of the day, X amount of people were going to die. And he had to choose between steel workers in the city or farmers in the countryside, and he picked one. I don't necessarily think all choices are that binary, and I think there could have been a lot better ones. And maybe you shouldn't kill all your experts and you'll have better opinions to choose from.
Yep.
Stalin's a piece of shit, but it's like at the end of the day, like he had to make a decision and he made one. And it's always cast as Stalin went around the countryside maniacally laughing, eating cake while people starved to death. It's like, well, no, he had to allocate resources and there weren't enough. There was a fucking
well, and he might have eaten cake, but we don't know that.
Oh, I guarantee he did. I mean, there's the famous pictures of Stalin. Historical fact, by the way, a fun one. There's very famous photos of Stalin, and they were used in propaganda in Russia, and it's called Stalin and the Little Girl. And you'll literally see photos, and this is where, by the way, I love that people referred to Joe Biden as this because he was referred to as Uncle Joe when these came out, and he was Uncle Joe, which, by the way, Stalin was not his name. His name was actually like...
Stalin is like Steel or something, but his name is like...
Yeah. His name was like Yergy Russian-sounding names. And he chose Joseph Stalin because it translates to Man of Steel. And he's got these photos of him. You'll see these photos of him like lovingly hanging out with this sweet little girl, having a great time. Everything's good in communist Russia. The thing is the reason she was there and they took photos is because he was distracting her as they were executing her father.
Oh, that's lovely.
Yeah, they brought her dad in to shoot him. And Joseph Stalin was like, hey, come here, little girl. And the person's like, hey, this is a good photo up. And they took it. It was constantly doing this. Look, Stalin's good with the kids. And it's like, I mean, he's good at distracting kids while their parents are being shot. So yeah, Stalin sucks. Anyway, this is a tangent. Let's get back on track, listeners. So here is where Marxism takes flight. Okay, here's where this is differentiated from French socialism or anything that came before, is the idea of class struggle. Okay, Marx coined this term and basically said that all of human history is class struggle. And I would have to agree with him. Now, class struggle in political science, right? It's a political science term and philosophical. And socialists and Marxists use the term class conflict to basically define social class by its relationship to the means of production. Okay, and you hear that word a lot, the means of production. And the means of production are, again, we talk about, they're factories, agricultural land where you grow food, industrial machinery, right? Kay's a machinist. He works at places that have machines that produce and create things. Those machines, those CNC machines, and the warehouse they're under are the means of production. And it's not just physically producing something. A train that hauls cargo, or an 18-wheeler that hauls cargo down the highway, that is a means of production, because production doesn't mean physical objects. Production is production of capital. So let's remember that. The things that generate capital, that is the means of production. And so the social control of the labor and the production of goods and services is a political contest between the social classes. That's what it basically means. The conflict is between the capitalist class, who owns most of society's wealth and the means of production, and the proletariat on the other side. And the proletariat is the working class, which is everyone from blue-collar work like agriculture, manufacturing, transportation, but it's also the white-collar jobs like retail, service, event management, even, basically, if you receive a paycheck, you're proletariat. You may think the executive at the top of your company is in the capitalist class, but they're not. If they don't own the means of producing capital, they simply manage it. The vice president or the president of your corporation does not own the company. He is a manager, which means they're like cops. They're class traders, sure, but they're still proletarian. They are earning a wage through labor. Now, the other class is smaller by far, but it's the bourgeoisie, which is the French term we talked about earlier for the middle class. Now, as Americans, don't get this twisted, guys. This is another tricky terminology that we have usurped. The middle class is not what we think it is, okay? The middle class, again, the French deemed these classes, and it's the class that's in between royalty and peasants. That's why it's in the middle. You have the royalty at the top, and you have the peasants at the bottom. And who's in the middle? Again, this is people who are not royalty but very wealthy. These are the guys who owned land and resources that produce capital. The clergy, huge farm owners, people who own just vast amounts of gold, that kind of thing. They were the owners of merchant fleets, right? And huge textile sweatshops. These are the middle class. Not long after, they'd be people like Carnegie, Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan. And today we see it again still. People like Bezos and Bill Gates and Richard Branson. These guys are the bourgeoisie. Okay, these are the capitalists, people who own the means of producing capital, not people who are executives under them. Those are just bootlickers who get a lot of money. The other thing they established in this is that division of property we talked about earlier, the public property, like the roads you drive on and the government buildings you go into and courthouses, private property, which is like businesses and privately owned land, and then personal property, like your home, your car, your backpack. And capitalists, again, have used that terminology to scare you, but that's what they mean, is they think that the control of private property, warehouses, land, that kind of thing, that should be controlled by the people. So in this manifesto, right, Karl Marx doesn't just talk about the past, he talks about the future. And what did he predict, right? Because that's a good one, is okay, this is now, fucking 150 something years old. By now we can judge it based on what it got right, what it got wrong. How do we know Nostradamus was a dipshit and a charlatan? Because he didn't actually predict anything. He just said, "Oh, I see a vision of a swamp and a crow and a volcano somewhere." And everyone's like, "Oh my god, 9/11." It's bullshit. If you can predict something that will actually happen, it means your theory was right. If 100 years later none of it comes true and the opposite holds true, well, then your theory's bullshit. And it's not perfect. There are things that are wrong, but the manifest lays out kind of a future prediction where only the bad parts have basically come true and not the good stuff. And it's nuts to think about. At the time, we're talking mid-1800s, right? Modern capitalism was new. It was regional. It relied on local industry. It was not very prevalent. It did not rule nations or international trade. International trade existed in weird blocks. There was no globalism, right? But what it did predict, and again, people like Thomas Paine and Karl Marx took a look around and they could see where this was going. They knew exactly the kind of world that was about to get created by steel plants and sweatshops. And it predicted wage slave markets where huge sums of humans would work and struggle to survive to support these extra extravagant lives to a tiny amount of capitalists like Bezos, who goes into space. They're ultra wealthy. These guys shoot themselves into space for competition, or they live holed up in mansions compounding wealth and you never even hear of them because they literally just go crazy inside their own mansions. And they become more isolated from reality either way. And while that goes on, all of us, everyone else struggles to put food on the table, pay tuition fees, juggle one credit card for another, or fight depression. We act as if our lives are carefree. We claim that we like what we do and do what we like and we're totally free. But in reality, most Americans cry themselves to sleep. That's the world we live in. And Marx predicted that. The Manifesto predicts that people will be completely removed from their labor and will live a slave wage, soulless existence. And Marx's only failing I see here was that in thinking that capitalism would be over soon. He failed to predict that capitalist propaganda would make workers start to see themselves as consumers instead of workers. He thought this whole capitalism thing was going to last for a century at most and be over. He thought the workers were about to unite because the Industrial Revolution had created a monster. And he loved and hated it. He talked about the Industrial Revolution like, this will eventually take care of all the needs of mankind. It's amazing. We need to wrestle its control away from the most evil and selfish among us. And he thought there was going to be a revolution really soon. And it didn't happen. There's a revolution in some places, but it didn't take hold. And so even though he thought industrialization was going to lead to a better life, no one understood climate change back then. That's kind of the other biggie here, right? He thought that wage slavery was going to be the biggest affront to mankind. And turns out capitalism did bring it about, but it brought about the end of the world physically sooner than we thought, right? But he did leave one statement that I always thought was haunting about this. That I've heard this a lot, and I looked up just to make sure my quote was accurate. Basically, he just said that, he said those who profit from the existing system would resist any fundamental change to it, even if it jeopardized the lives of future generations to come. The rationale of capitalism lies in the maximization of profit. No other ends can modify this aim. So even if it destroys the world, capitalists will not stop. And we see he knew that in the 1800s. And we see that now with oil companies willfully hiding their data and letting climate change skyrocket for profit, because that is what capitalism brings you. And the failure to go after that is kind of the biggest problem that socialists and capitalists come across, is because, liberals will cry about income inequality, but they'll completely ignore the cause of the problem. And that's the ownership of the means of production. That causes slavery, misery, global poverty, famine, now the annihilation of the environment, to a degree that our planet's probably going to be unlivable in 100 years. But we don't talk about that. We try to make incremental changes, but, again, it's not gospel, take it for what it is. But Marx stated that capitalism could only be overthrown by a means of revolution carried out by the working class. He said the proletarian movement is the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority in the interest of the immense majority. And that says something. And then you start looking at, well, when do we actually see massive changes for the better to overthrow capitalism? And yeah, it actually only does come through mass violent revolution. I just want to read something real quick. It's the last lines of the Communist Manifesto, right? And he says the communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing conditions. Let the ruling class tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite. That's how it closes out. And it leaves us with this. That's where socialism leads us, with this idea of it's all or nothing. And that's typically where socialists and liberals come into conflict, is revolution or reformation.
We talked about this before. It's I mentioned this. People in these camps typically fall into two categories: revolutionaries, or reformists. Just to reiterate, Bernie Sanders is a good example of a reformist. Do I agree with a lot of Bernie's ideas? Absolutely. Chris does
Most
too.
of them.
Yeah. But Bernie Sanders' fundamental flaw is that he believes unequivocally that change can come from within, that all you have to do is work within the system and eventually you can change it. Bernie Sanders has been pitching that for the last 50 years?
And that you can work within the Democratic Party, and they fuck him over every time.
And again, it has taken him this long to even get the barest minimum of his views and policies into effect. And even when he does get some of them passed, they're hatcheted in half. I mean, yeah. Look at what we got for Obamacare. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying we shouldn't be striving to have healthcare and cover more people, but you had to adopt a shitty Republican version of it just to get it to pass.
Yeah, and we still didn't get single-payer healthcare
at all,
which isn't even socialism. It's allowing the capitalist system to still profit, just that everyone gets to play ball now. Like, literally, that's what was fought for, was, okay, can we just make sure that every single person at least gets to play in the capitalist system of healthcare? And even that was too much. We don't have that. Because even access to the game is restricted for the wealthy.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. And so that's what you have to see this as. And again, I want to make a distinction here. Just because some people fall into the category of revolutionist and some people, revolutionary, and some people fall into the category of reformist, doesn't mean you can't get along, doesn't mean you can't agree with them. But there is a point where I think, and this is where I think I agree more with Chris, where eventually the reformists are going to have to either join up or get out of the way.
And that is where we are going to call an intermission. Everyone's going to need to run to the lobby and grab some snacks. This is going to be a long episode. It's a 2-parter, and we didn't want to destroy your commute and your ear holes for 2 hours. So this is our first part. Stick around, because Kay and I get even more heated, and someone gets called a bitch. It's me. I'm bitches.
All day long. All this and more on the next exciting episode of the Alt Left Podcast.
So, we will see you next week. We will be launching the second half of this, so stay tuned. I hope you like it as much as we like recording it.